I'd like to welcome you to the second Raytheon Business Ethics Lecture. And in keeping with that, I want to welcome Ray Gilmartin, who I'm going to introduce to you in a minute, but also Joan Wainwright, the Vice President of Public Affairs at Merck, is here as well. My name is Mike Hoffman. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Business Ethics, which hosts these events. And we're now in, I guess, about our 6th or 7th year of this Business Ethics Lectureship Series. The first 10 lectureships were sponsored by Sears, Roebuck, and now we have started a whole new beginning to our lectureship series with our sponsor being Raytheon Company. And I also want to welcome in the audience Patty Ellis, who's Vice President of Ethics and Compliance at Raytheon Company. Raytheon has been a great supporter of the Center for Business Ethics in Bentley College for many years, and this is just another evidence, another event in that partnership between the Center for Business Ethics and Raytheon. And so we're very grateful for Raytheon Company to continuing sponsoring events at the center. Bentley is also now a partner in WGBH's Forum Network, which provides webcasts of free public lectures from Boston's leading cultural and educational institutions. Mr. Gilmartin is kindly allowing us to video his lecture in order that it can be included in this collection. So if you would like to view the lecture at a later date, you'll be able to find it at www.wgbh.org/forum. You can also find a videotape of that lecture in the Center for Business Ethics here at Bentley, which is on this floor right outside the forum at the other end of the hallway. I also want to, before I forget it, let you know that you're all invited to a reception in the Commons on the 3rd floor of this building immediately following the lecture, where you'll have a chance to meet many of our guests who've come from really not only around Boston, but from New York and from Arkansas and a variety of other places. These are people who are in the business ethics field from companies and universities and who are friends of the center and the college, some alumni, but many who have been working in this vineyard of business ethics for quite some time. But also you'll have a chance to meet our guest speaker, Mr. Ray Gilmartin. There will also be a question and answer period following Mr. Gilmartin's address. I'll come back up on stage after he finishes and help him field some questions from you all. Also, as you know, many of your colleagues, many of your peers are over in the auditorium. You were the lucky ones to get seats to the live performance, but there are probably 300 or 400 of your classmates and other people either in the forum here in this building or over in the auditorium. I want to just say a couple of words about Merck itself. Merck is one of the world's largest research-driven pharmaceutical companies. The company employs more than 66,000 people worldwide and is headquartered in New Jersey. This year, Business Week ranked Merck number 20 out of 50 top-performing companies. The magazine has been ranking the top-performing companies in the S&P 500 index for 7 years, and Merck is the only company to make the list 7 out of the 7 years. Merck is widely recognized for its efforts to improve global health and access to medicines. In September of 2002, Merck earned one of the only 2 AAA ratings for ethics by the Management and Excellence Group. Also, a recent issue of The Economist stated that Merck has, and I quote, won the admiration of advocates of corporate responsibility, unquote, and is considered the, quote, acceptable face of capitalism, unquote. It's now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Gilmartin, who joined Merck as President and Chief Executive Officer in June of 1994, the first President and CEO of the company hired from outside the company. He was named Chairman of the Board in November of 1994. There are a number of other things that you might very well want to read about Mr. Gilmartin, and they're on your flyers that I hope you have picked up from outside. If you haven't, then you might want to pick them up before you leave. But he's no stranger to the Boston area. In fact, when we were discussing this a bit in my office prior to this lecture, I learned a lot about his experiences in Boston. He came in 1966 to get his MBA from Harvard Business School, and he worked for 8 years at Arthur D. Little in Cambridge. Mr. Gilmartin is active in issues that involve the pharmaceutical industry both globally and domestically. Earlier this year, he was sworn in as a member of President Bush's Export Council. He was asked to chair the subcommittee on stewardship to emphasize that America's companies not only bring their capital, but also their values to world markets. He serves on many boards, including the boards of General Mills, Microsoft, and on Harvard Business School's Board of Directors of the Associates. He also serves on boards of several organizations involved with healthcare and health policy, including the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association. He is a director of the College Fund/UNCF and a trustee of the Healthcare Leadership Council. Mr. Gilmartin will discuss the importance of business leaders today, ensuring that ethics is deeply embedded in the culture of their organizations, so that the actions of every employee every day reflect a true commitment to the ethical behavior in all that they do. He will also discuss this afternoon how, in today's global economy, corporations must maintain their fundamental commitment to ethical behavior everywhere they do business. So please join me in welcoming our Raytheon Business Ethics lecturer today, Ray Gilmartin.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Hoffman, for that great introduction. I very much enjoy being here, and I think one of the great places to be in America is on a college campus, because colleges are filled with intellectual energy, enthusiasm for questioning old ideas and exploring new ones, and with a commitment of finding ways to make the world a better place. And so thank you for inviting me to be with you today, and thanks to your Center for Business Ethics for sponsoring this event, and thank you to Raytheon. I do have a lot of experience in Boston, some 10 years here, and frequent trips back for a variety of reasons having to do with health policy and my continuing association with that business school down the road. But and I've always found it extremely stimulating and energizing to return to the Boston area. And so to me, it's a real pleasure and an honor to have an opportunity to spend a few hours with you this afternoon. In thinking about what I would say to you today, the first thing that came to mind is something that I heard at one of my class reunions at Harvard Business School. And I always try to go back to my reunions, and not only because of a chance to see old friends, but also for the reasons we were talking about earlier, the intellectual stimulation in terms of listening to lectures about some of the work that's currently underway at the school. And I really like that intellectual stimulation. And the other good thing is you don't have to pay tuition to get that. although as you will discover when you graduate, there are other ways of getting you involved, which I'm happy to do, by the way, and encourage you as well. But several years ago, one of the reunion lectures focused on how ethics was being integrated into the curriculum, into every aspect of its curriculum, so that students would learn to integrate ethical standards in their day-to-day decision-making as business leaders. And the professor went on to tell us about a discussion question that he always asked his students, most of whom had been out in the workforce before coming back to school. And he asked this question early each semester to set the stage. He posed this question in part to help him gauge the views of the students and what their experiences were and how they would think about business ethics as part of this integrated curriculum. And his question was really quite simple. He said, have you ever found yourself in a situation where you were asked to do something that you thought was unethical? And if so, describe it. And he reported that a surprising number of his students said that in their view, they had been asked to do something they knew was unethical, wrong. He also reported that the experience for this young talent was devastating, not simply disturbing, but devastating, especially when it happens to people earlier in their careers. And having been fortunate not having found myself in that kind of situation, I was fascinated by what he was reporting. But what he told me next really caught my attention, because at that point I was the CEO of Becton Dickinson, a medical device firm. I joined Merck in 1994. He said that most of the students believed that if the CEO of the organization had known what was going on, the CEO would not have permitted it. And as I said, as the CEO myself, I found this observation to be very illuminating, but also very important to me. And it reinforced my own belief and experience that in a corporation, it's not enough for someone like myself to say, we're an ethical company, we hire ethical people, and we expect you to do the right thing. That's certainly necessary, but far from sufficient. So one must go way beyond that. One must also ensure that the environment in which our people work, say at Merck or in any organization, that the environment not only expects but supports ethical behavior, and not only opposes but roots out unethical behavior. But what is ethical behavior? How do you define it? And it's not easy. There are entire courses on ethics, and in fact, in preparing for this, we counted 6 courses with ethics in their titles offered by your philosophy department. But one thing I'm not going to define as ethics is sort of dramatic acts and important acts of corporate responsibility. I could talk to you about the Mectazan donation program that we have serving 30 million people in 33 countries that prevents river blindness, or the efforts we have in Botswana to attack HIV/AIDS in a comprehensive way. But when I'm talking about ethics this afternoon, I'm talking about what happens in one's company or organization every day at every level in the organization. And I would also suggest that ethical behavior is not just simply complying with the rules. It demands a higher standard. It means instead of looking for loopholes, you see the rules as the foundation of moral behavior. And as Plato put it, good people do not need laws to tell them how to act responsibly, while bad people will always find a way around the laws. These days, it seems that the only time you read about business ethics is in the context of the Enrons, the WorldComs, and Tycos of the world. They make the news for the outrageous ways in which they flouted even their own ethical standards. But even though you won't read about it, there are also companies on the opposite end of that spectrum, corporations that are fiercely determined to hold themselves to the highest standards of ethics and integrity. And as on any continuum, there are many companies that fall someplace in between. My direct experience, and I was talking with this earlier about Dr. Hoffman, was in the early 90s with the Ethics Resource Center, a nonprofit organization that began a year after this organization began to promote the creation of ethical work environments. And I had the privilege of being chairman of that board for a couple of years. And I learned a great deal from that exposure. But this organization has been tracking for the past decade the ethical environment in corporate America. And earlier this year, the center released its latest scientific survey of 1,500 workers across the country. And I'd like to share with you some of the results. And they're actually surprisingly, particularly in the events of the past few years, surprisingly encouraging. The survey showed that over the past 10 years, the percentage of employees who observed misconduct has dropped from about 31% to 22%. It also showed that employee reporting of misconduct increased from 48% to 65%. And those who said they felt pressured to compromise their ethical standards dropped to a new low of 10%. Yet, despite this improvement, the survey also found that nearly half of all non-management employees are still reluctant to report misconduct. This reluctance stems from concern that the reported misconduct would be ignored or that the report would not be kept confidential. However, in those companies in which a strong ethics program is in place, employees are more likely to report misconduct and to believe that those reports will be taken seriously. And that's why strong ethics programs are key to creating a strong ethical corporate culture. But what constitutes a strong ethical culture? Now, I believe a company proves its commitment to the highest standards of ethics and integrity by meeting three very important goals. First, its top leaders must set the right tone, and that tone must be echoed throughout the organization. In thought, word, and deed, a company's leaders must clearly and unambiguously both advocate and model ethical behavior. Next, they must offer formal training in ethics and standards of conduct, not just so that people will know what's expected of them, but so they can learn how to identify a potential ethical dilemma and prevent it from actually becoming one. Employees should also have a place to turn for advice about concerns or doubts that they may have regarding the situation they may be facing. Third, it must provide formal mechanisms, both inside and outside one's organizational structure, for reporting any wrongdoing, should it occur or be suspected of occurring. And we've embraced these goals at Merck, and I would like to tell you why I believe that's important and detail for you what we have done to meet these goals. In the pharmaceutical industry, one of the most valuable assets a company has is its reputation. The work we do is a public trust. When we are researching, developing, and manufacturing drugs that people rely on to prevent or treat disease in themselves or their families, we should be expected to maintain the highest standards of ethics and integrity. And at Merck, that's the standard to which we hold ourselves. The foundation of our commitment to ethics at Merck is our culture and our tradition. And Merck is proud of a long history of strict adherence to the highest standards of integrity and ethics. In a very real sense, the people at Merck are our own best watchdog, for unethical behavior by anyone would tarnish the hard-won reputation of all. And that's why we train our managers in ethical behavior, why we include ethics as part of our annual performance reviews, and why it's one of the measures that we use to make decisions about advancement. For a company that cares a lot about results, how many new drugs we've developed, the growth of sales and earnings, how our stock price is doing, for a company with all of those aspirations, we also care a lot about how we go about achieving those results. But as effective as that is, it's clearly not enough. And that is why shortly after I came to Merck in 1994, I created Merck's first Office of Ethics. I set that up in 1995. And this office is responsible for carrying out every aspect of our ethics policies, both here in the United States and abroad. And the office has been headed since its founding by Jacqueline Brevard, who, by the way, in 1995 was one of the first attendees, if you will, in your class that you have for managing ethics in organizations, and has clearly benefited greatly from that experience here. She does a terrific job. When we established the Office of Ethics, I charged it with several important objectives, all of which complemented the overarching goals that I mentioned a few moments ago. First, develop one global code of conduct for every Merck employee in every office in every country in which we operate. Second, develop the training to ensure that all Merck employees were not only familiar with our code of conduct, but would know how to apply it in their work. Third, establish fully staffed and supported confidential structures that our employees could use to ask questions about ethical dilemmas they faced or report unethical behavior they knew or suspected was taking place. And fourth, develop a strategic communications plan to ensure that all of our people knew not only what resources were available to them, but how to access those resources. We also gave our new Office of Ethics complete independence within the company. Jackie Bavard reports directly to me. Although she's administratively housed in our law department, she reports to me, and we meet each quarter so she can keep me fully apprised of how her office is doing, what the climate is within the organization, what kind of support that she's getting, and what are the general patterns of things that we're finding. It's important, I think, to point out that when I decided to establish the Ethics Office, it wasn't because I had any doubt about the integrity and ethics of Merck employees. Quite the contrary. As I said a moment ago, Merck has a long history of adhering to the highest standards of conduct and behavior. But one cannot rely on past performance, which is, after all, no guarantee of future results. And when a company is growing as rapidly as ours is, and we're adding new people and expanding operations around the world, it's important to ensure that every Merck person knows that meeting the highest ethical standards is not just part of how we do business, it's at the heart of how we do business. The first test our new office faced was developing a global set of standards. As those of you who have read Thomas Friedman's book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, know, the rapid globalization of the world economy is posing many new challenges to nations, corporations, and individuals in a whole host of areas, including ethics. Traditionally, I think companies have drafted standards of conduct designed just for use in the U.S. and then have exported those codes to their overseas operations, typically around compliance and legal compliance. And those codes will cite chapter and verse of American laws against price fixing or anti-competitive practices, for example. But they don't necessarily address the underlying values that underlie the laws. For a company like Merck, with operations on virtually every continent in the world, not in Antarctica at this point, that doesn't work. And that's why Merck's guides to our, what we call our values and standards, deliberately does not read like an obscure legal document. It reads more like a moral document. Our code of conduct says things such as, we compete fairly and honestly. We strive to maintain an environment free of harassment, where all employees are respected. And we may not buy or sell Merck securities on the basis of non-public material information. But because they are based on fundamental questions of right and wrong, these standards can and do apply everywhere in the world and to everyone. And I should point out, though, that our code of conduct was the work product of people from every part of the company, in every part of the world. Interviews and focus groups were held both here in the United States and abroad, and anonymous questionnaires were distributed worldwide. We did this not because we believe that basic concepts of right and wrong vary around the world, but rather the best ways in which we talk about them do vary. And we wanted to find universal language to communicate universal values. If you were to visit our ethics office in our headquarters in New Jersey, the first thing you would notice is a wall full of electric blue and purple rectangles. And while they look like a piece of modern art, they are, in fact, identical copies of our Values and Standards brochure, written in 25 different languages. And that's as clear a representation of globalization of ethics as I think you'll find. Of course, creating rigorous ethical standards is just the first step. Any company that's serious about its standards has to make every effort to train their people in what the standards mean to them on a day-to-day basis and how they apply to their day-to-day business life. As the Ethics Resource Center said recently, to be effective, codes of conduct need to be actual living documents, not just framed pieces of paper hanging on companies' walls. And so while we are proud to display on our walls our code of conduct in 25 different languages, that's where our commitment begins, not ends. At Merck, every new employee receives, as part of their orientation training, a section that covers our values and standards. And that gives employees all the information they need about the resources available to them through our Office of Ethics. Similarly, when employees move up the corporate ladder and acquire or reach higher levels of leadership responsibility, our ethical standards are reinforced as part of the training they receive for their new positions. And while the values and standards document is the same in every language, we recognize that our training must take into account the various situations that people face in different parts of the world. We knew that we would, in some cases, be asking people to act in ways that were contrary to prevailing cultural practices, such as how women in the workplace are treated or what constitutes a bribe. So we target our training in different countries or regions to assist our employees in meeting the real-world challenges they are likely to face. Let me give you an example. In some of the countries in which Merck does business, our employees occasionally interact with people who are so uncomfortable doing business with women that they want them removed from a project. And some companies might say, well, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. But at Merck, we strongly believe in equal opportunity for women, no matter where they work, and we would never honor such a request. So in those countries, we'll give our employees tips about how to deal with this attitude without in any way compromising our commitment to gender equality. And we have found that when people see that we will stand up behind our female employees, they change their attitude, and they'll work with our women on an equal footing. Pragmatic self-interest takes over. Their desire to do business with us overrides the reluctance to work with us. But we would not have found that out had we compromised our ethical commitment to equal opportunity for our female employees in every part of the world. In addition, we tailor our training to meet the needs of people holding different jobs within the company. The real-world dilemmas that a pharmaceutical sales rep will face are different than those likely to confront someone who works in a research lab or in a manufacturing facility. Our training takes that into account. It's also important that training offers more than just theory. It must provide practical advice. Through our ethics awareness workshops, we provide our employees with practical advice, with case studies that will help them recognize and then deal with potential ethical dilemmas. These workshops teach people how to apply our values and standards in the real world. And we recognize that when people are striving to succeed, they may be tempted to take an occasional ethical shortcut. And these workshops give our employees practical advice on how to succeed and to short-circuit that temptation. Of course, no amount of training is ever sufficient to prepare people to meet every ethical question they confront at work. And there's plenty of gray areas in ethics, and sometimes certain ethical imperatives may appear to be in conflict. And most people who get caught up in unethical behavior are not fundamentally bad. More often than not, they're good people who are doing something unethical in the mistaken belief they're helping the company, or they're in an ethical dilemma that they don't realize they're in the middle of. And that's why it's crucial to give employees a place where they can turn for guidance. At Merck, we have several mechanisms in place. Our Office of Ethics is always available to provide advice, either by phone, email, fax, or even regular mail. In addition, we have established what we call the Merck Advice Line, formerly known before the establishment of the Office of Ethics as the Hotline, which was a place where, in theory, you turn people in. But we renamed that the Advice Line, a toll-free number that employees can contact anonymously or identify themselves if they wish to seek advice on an ethical dilemma or report actual or suspected violations of our Code of Conduct. To ensure employees of the confidential nature of the advice line, it rings off-site at an independent third-party vendor so no one need worry about being identified by caller ID. The fascinating thing is that once we started these ethics awareness workshops, it is literally the case that calls come in from different parts of the world where an employee will actually say, I'm so-and-so, identify themselves, and I'm facing this situation, and I really need some advice about how I should deal with it. At which point, we're able to, in a practical way, be able to provide that kind of advice and counsel. And just consider how powerful that is. A further resource, and this is very important, is our Merck Ombudsman program. Every one of our major locations in the U.S. has an ombudsman on site to whom people can turn. And this is yet another confidential alternative that people can use to help them navigate a potential ethical minefield. It's interesting to note that most of the calls that come into our advice line or come through our ombudsman are about supervisor-employee relationships. That's the overwhelming majority of the calls that we get, which is also an issue of ethics. And we have found that this has provided us with an unintended benefit. Finding out about an issue between a supervisor and his or her employee gives us an opportunity not just to address the specific situation itself, but to also help develop the skills and the leadership potential of the supervisor. And let me give you an example that seems kind of straightforward, but it's really, I think, quite interesting. Is that one of the ombudsmen was working with a woman sales representative in the U.S. who felt that she was being very successful, but had a growing problem as far as she was concerned with her manager. And she felt she was doing a good job, as I said, but yet she felt her manager was highly critical of her and really didn't have a good thing to say at any time and was, in her belief, really giving her a hard time. And after a while, she began to suspect that her manager might have been discriminating against her because of her gender. And so she went to the ombudsman for help. And when following up with the manager, the ombudsman, working with the manager, said, what do you think of so-and-so? He immediately replied, oh, she's one of the best people I have working for me. She's terrific. She's great. And when we told him, through this counseling process about the situation from her perspective, he was shocked. He was stunned. He was apparently unaware about how his management style was affecting his staff, both men and women, as it turns out. So instead of having a situation that would be festering in terms of a potential discrimination or a view of discrimination, it was basically a leader who had not basically lived up or fully developed his leadership skills and therefore had the opportunity to change significantly the work environment in that particular region. Of course, all of this effort is worth nothing if people within the company don't know it's available. An advice line that never rings isn't doing anyone any good. An ombudsman office who is empty isn't doing anyone any good either. That's why we really put a lot of effort to effectively communicate information about the full scope of resources that are available that supports our commitment to the highest standards of ethics and integrity. For example, we need to be sure that the phone numbers are readily available, that employees know who the ombudsman is on their site, they know where to have or to access immediately our code of conduct, and that managers at every level reinforce the importance of ethics. Now, of course, communicating the importance of ethical behavior requires much more than words alone. Actions, as all of you know, always speak louder than words. And that's why, as I mentioned earlier, we make ethical behavior, including treating others with dignity and respect, an integral part of performance reviews and our advancement decisions. You're not going to make it at Merck if we have any doubts about your character, about your standards of integrity, about whether or not you treat people who work with you or around you with dignity and respect. I travel extensively throughout the world. I like to do that. I like to go out and see what's going on. And it's really exciting for me to listen to people in various parts of the world describe with some pride and enthusiasm how important this ethics training has been to them and how it's given them the confidence to face some very difficult situations and the kind of pride that they have in basically how their business conduct is not only allowing them to be successful, but successful in the way that is consistent with our own personal values. And I basically, it's fascinating to be in Budapest talking to a product manager that's come in from Croatia and sounds exactly like the marketing people we would have in Texas in terms of the things that he or she is talking about. And also talking with exactly the same pride about how, as being associated with Merck, has enabled him or her to conduct themselves in a way that they can be really proud of. So our employees not only feel good about being part of a company that values doing the right thing, they're also finding that in their day-to-day business life, where they want to be successful, that it is giving them a long-term competitive advantage. Dealing with people honestly and fairly, treating all those with whom you work, both inside and outside the company, with dignity and respect, meeting your commitments. These are the foundations on which strong business relationships are built. It's also the way strong businesses are built. So at Merck, our ability to succeed is directly tied to our ability to attract the best young talent available. And when you work on the cutting edge of science, and your future depends on your ability to develop novel medicines that offer true advances in patient care and offer real value to the patient, you have to be able to attract the best and the brightest. And we found that our clear commitment to ethics and integrity does help us attract and retain exactly the sort of talented people we need to meet our goals. In my experience, the way to succeed in business is to do something worthwhile. That is, seek to make a contribution in a way that makes you proud of what you do. You don't want to find yourself in a position that those students I mentioned earlier at the start of my remarks did, of being asked to compromise your values for the sake of your job. No job is worth that. So when you complete your education and are weighing several job offers, as I'm sure you will be, I urge you to integrate, and I'm sure you will, into your calculations each company's commitment to ethics and integrity. You will find that a company that honors its obligation to nurture an ethical environment is a better place to work and a better place to succeed. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and now I'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gilmartin. We're going to have some questions now from the audience, so don't be bashful. Speak right up. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Gilmartin, for being here today. Peter
you're
Mark
welcome.
I teach General Business 101 here at Bentley. And in that class, we study various mission statements, values, and operating principles of high-profile companies. And Bentley also maintains a web poll on legal accountability for corporate values and operating principles. And I'd like to read you, if I could, the question that's out there on that web poll, and then ask if you'd be kind enough to share your response to it with the audience. And the question is, should corporate executives and or their companies be held legally accountable for violating and or misrepresenting corporately declared operating principles and values, the outcome of which results in physical, mental, and financial harm to employees, customers, and stockholders?
Well, I think that since we're talking about ethics, we're making a clear distinction between legal, which is, as far as we're concerned, sets the floor for things, and that's what we have all the training about for compliance, and ethical behavior, which is a higher standard. I think that as you ratchet up basically what should be legal and how people should be held accountable and so on, we'll still always be left with the necessity of being able to fill in the gray area through conduct that is consistent with the values and traditions, say, of our company, and a commitment to high standards and high integrity. So, I think that trying to legalize or to create legal liability as a way of getting better, more ethical behavior has some real limitations. Because ethical behavior, as I said, goes beyond looking for loopholes or bending the laws or being on the edge of the laws or looking for precise definitions of the laws. I think that the way to go is along the lines that I described here in my remarks, which is to create an environment that supports ethical behavior, that supports behavior according to high standards of integrity. And because all of these things are such a gray area, and what happens every day in your company at every levels is to try to just create more legal liability, I don't think will succeed in achieving more ethical behavior. I think it ties in with the kinds of things that I was talking about.
Thank you.
I'm a little bit handicapped with the lights, so to be
Yeah,
able to see up. So
pretty bright.
we'll try to look up for you.
Okay.
Yes.
What is the biggest ethical issue you faced with being a Merck CEO?
I'm sorry?
What is the biggest ethical issue for you faced with being CEO?
Well, I think that to change that question a little bit, I would put it in terms of, given the fact that I'm surrounded by very talented people and a long history of ethical behavior, I don't find myself in a situation where I'm faced with ethical dilemmas that I have to deal with personally. I mean, things, given the kind of culture and environment we have, instinctively, I think we know how to move and how to act and what we're responsible for. What I am very conscious of is my responsibility to all the people at Merck to create an environment in which they feel comfortable and are supported in behaving in an ethical manner. And by behaving in an ethical manner, they can be personally successful as well as proud of what they do. And the story I told at the beginning really struck home to me about young talent who felt they had been placed in situations where they were being asked to do something unethical. And it occurred at very low levels of the organization. It was a very direct function of their immediate supervisor. How devastating that was really struck me. I would expect that, but just hearing it firsthand just reinforces that. And also the fact that if the CEO had known about that, it wouldn't happen. And that just made it all the more clear to me how important it was for me to fulfill my responsibility in carrying out the kind of program that I described to you this afternoon to ensure that that didn't happen to people in Merck.
There's a question up. Oh, yeah.
I guess in discussions on campus about ethics, one of the things that's emerged as one of the factors that really promotes unethical behavior is when people perceive that following the rules puts them at a disadvantage.
Right.
And you mentioned the example of, say, women doing business in a culture where there might be a pretty strong hierarchy in terms of male and female roles. Would you think that you're putting maybe, or could it occur that you're actually putting a woman at a disadvantage by putting her in that situation? Or would actually, in terms of setting her up for failure? And also, I mean, it seems like do you have a specific example of Merck being supportive of a woman in that situation? Because it just seems, with the competition being so steep, especially internationally, that
right.
Merck would really be taking a strong stand by towing the line in that area.
Right. I think it all boils down to how much support you provide for your people in terms of training, awareness, and the support you provide in the ways in which they can seek advice and counsel about how to deal with situations in which they feel that they're at a disadvantage. You're absolutely right that when we set, as we do, very high standards of behavior, and in many cases, it can vary in different parts of the world, that we're holding our people to higher standards of behavior than maybe some other of their competitors might be handling. Or even if they are, the other companies are holding high standards, that their people aren't necessarily following those standards. So that's why the ethics awareness workshops are so important. That's why this training is so important. That's why being able to seek advice is so important, is that so people can see themselves, see how to be successful in these environments, and that they're not really at a disadvantage to competition. If you don't provide that kind of support, the temptation to short circuit or the need to be successful, it runs a very real risk that people will, in effect, bend the rules or do something unethical. And so therefore, we're very conscious, and that's why all this training I described is a crucial part of our program. That's why, as I said, just sending out a code of conduct and said, these are the rules, follow those rules, do the right thing, is far from sufficient. You really have to help people understand a very practical, real-world way how to do it and still be successful. And we've had that experience. That works.
I see another question way in the back. Do you have the walking mic, Vi? Maybe you could go up.
Thank you.
You might identify yourself. We can't even see your face from that light right now.
That's right. Talk about the hot lights.
That's right. My name is Ronald Rivas. I teach in the GB 401, which is the strategic capstone for the undergrads. And I have a question regarding a global competitive advantage. And I want to see, you have mentioned very clear-cut, concrete situations that you have dealt in the company. Now, is there a way that the company has measured this impact in your global competitive positioning? Or perhaps you can suggest us. Being a researcher, I would love to put my finger and say, okay, here is what ethical behavior pays. And I don't know, perhaps you can elucidate me on a path to find those measures.
Right. As you would expect, these are very difficult things to measure in terms of how is it a source of competitive advantage. And so, I'll give you anecdotes, which I think add up at the end of the day, if it occurs frequently enough, and I think it does, that shows that we do have an advantage. That to be in a setting in Shanghai with government officials from the Ministry of Health, and to have them compliment me on the behavior of Merck sales representatives and Merck people in general in terms of how they conduct themselves. And you're talking specifically about specifically about their ethical behavior, which basically to me right away sends a signal that we are seen as being consistent with our values in terms of how we behave. It also had a big impression on these government officials, inspiring confidence and trust in our people, which is a source of competitive advantage. The second thing is, as I described, is the kind of people that we are able to attract at Merck and be able to keep at Merck, but also beyond that, the kind of motivation that I can sense when I'm out in different parts of the world, and a sense of pride that people have, and therefore the commitment to the company's success, which is also an important source of competitive advantage. So I would say at the end of the day, since we're dealing with physicians, we're dealing with people's lives, that having Merck people conducting themselves in a way that inspires confidence and trust on the part of physicians who prescribe our medicines, confidence and trust on the part of patients who take them, confidence and trust on the part of regulators who regulate our manufacturing facilities, who approve our drugs, as well as confidence and trust, frankly, in the people who pay for our medicines, that we are a company that can be counted on to do the right thing and to portray our products in a way that is honest and ethical. And my firsthand experience in encountering all of these constituencies is that ethics is clearly a source of competitive advantage for us.
And I might just mention another thing that you mentioned in your lecture, Mr. Gilmartin, and that was how proud Merck employees feel about working for a company that stresses ethics and the importance of doing the right thing.
Exactly.
And I think the surveys I've seen, including the Ethics Resource Center survey and other surveys, employees indicate that that is an extremely high priority on their, or criterion on their list of where they will go and choose to work and what keeps them working in a place like that. So that's just another, I think, competitive advantage that you mentioned in your talk.
Absolutely, yes.
Another question? I wanted to ask you all a question while you were thinking of some other questions. One is, how many of you, before you heard Mr. Gilmartin's talk, knew that there was sort of a newly emerging American profession called the ethics officer profession, or that corporations had the kind of formal ethics and business conduct programs Merck has, for example? How many of you knew that before this lecture? It's interesting. I would say, just looking very quickly, maybe 30%, 25 to 30%. So I think one of the really great things about your lecture was the fact that it brings to light to a lot of freshmen, but other students who are here, the fact that many corporations today have these kinds of formal programs. And one of the things that I found most interesting about your lecture, and I wondered if you'd expand on it a bit, is the fact that ethics is built into the performance evaluation at the company. It seems to me that if you don't have ethics sort of as a part of the performance evaluation of employees, then it really isn't sort of infiltrated or inculcated into the culture like it should be.
Absolutely, I agree completely with that. And that's why within a year or two after we started the ethics office, we started a formal program on leadership development. And basically, it's built on the foundations of character. Does this individual display ethical behavior, treating people with dignity and respect? So it starts with that as a foundation. Obviously, competence in business, but also another element of being able to develop and care and support the people that work for these leaders, as well as being very effective communicator of our values and what we're trying to accomplish. And in another variation of that, we describe that to advance at Merck, we value people who see what needs to be done, have the conceptual and strategic capability to see that, can get it done. They know how organizations work, and they're effective in that regard about how to bring people together, select people, but finally and importantly, get it done in the right way. And we've instituted a program more formally in the last couple of years. Some organizations call it 360. We've had that, but this is what loosely labeled, because we all have this business jargon, but stakeholder feedback, where each person is evaluated. In fact, I'm doing it for myself this year as well, because I'm interested in basically where areas that I can continue to develop. But one of the key questions on this, which is asked of direct reports and stakeholders more broadly through the company, is a specific question about ethical behavior, the kind of standards that are set and how the person conducts themselves. Do they set up that kind of environment and culture? This survey is confidential. It's done by a third party. It's internet connected. So people can feel very comfortable in being very honest and straightforward in answering that question. So the evaluation that we do isn't just sort of a subjective feel of a supervisor, gee, this seems like an ethical person to me. We've got some hard information that we collect throughout the organization about that. And that, among many messages, send a very clear message about how strongly we feel about this.
There's a question back there.
Hello, my name is Michelle Podesta, and I'm a graduate student in the MBA program. My question is, during your lecture, you did tell a story of a woman who had an issue with her manager. She thought that she was being discriminated against.
Right.
And upon discussing it further with the manager, you found that it was more of an issue with his leadership style and not really discrimination.
Right.
The first part of my question you just answered in a roundabout way. I was going to ask, what are the resources available to help managers develop their leadership styles? And secondly, what actually happened in this specific case with that manager? Were the resources helpful to him or her?
The resources were helpful to that particular manager. And we have, and I did touch on it, as you said in my earlier answer, is that we have instituted formal leadership development training within the company. So, and it's tailored for, depending upon what level of the organization that any particular individual happens to be at. The principle, though, is that all of us exercise leadership in one way or another, regardless of whether or not we have anybody reporting to us. And so this leadership training applies to all. As we collect these case studies, if you will, they become an integral part of our leadership training. In other words, we're able to see patterns across the company in terms of where we may be deficit in terms of the kinds of training or development experiences we should be providing people, so we avoid exactly the kind of situation that I talked about during the lecture.
I see 2 or 3 hands. Vi, you may have to take that mic up. And while Vi is finding the people who are going to ask a question, I thought maybe before you left the stage, maybe you could just elaborate a little bit, not necessarily now, but I'll remind you again, about the whole experience that Merck had with their drug that helped, that found a cure for river blindness.
Right.
I was thinking of the analogy or the analogous situation, particularly with this gentleman's comment about how does being an ethical company actually give some kind of financial payback in terms of perhaps reputation or what have you. Johnson & Johnson's experience with Tylenol certainly is a tremendous example of an ethical act that they did, and
Right.
it was almost automatic in terms of how their culture reacted. It seems to me that a similar thing happened, and I wondered if you could comment on it before you leave, about Merck's experience with river blindness, its actions in that regard.
Sure.
My question is, how do you deal with doing business in places like my country, India, where giving bribes is kind of like a way of doing business? How do you do business in that country? How does it affect your ethics?
The answer is pretty straightforward, which is we don't do it. We don't give bribes. And there are situations, and first of all, it's against the law. I mean, it's very clear in terms of legal liability. But beyond that, once again, to equip ourselves with people where they may be placed in situations where they are encouraged in order to be successful to go against our own policies or go against the law. The experience that we've had is that by instilling confidence in our people and that they can say no to these things and how to say no to these things, what our experience has been is that the people who ask them for these things immediately back away and say, you know, I don't want to get you in trouble. I don't want you to do anything wrong as far as your company is concerned. And they move on from that point. So it's really fascinating that, to us, that if our people have the confidence, and that's what we instill them through the training, basically to say no and why, et cetera, that more often than not, the people that are asking for these things will back away right away. Now, I'm sure there are instances where we lose business. I'd gladly lose that business, and because we've got a long-term view here. Certainly, we're not going to break the law under any circumstance, but there are times when we'll lose. I'm sure we lose business when things are at the margin, and it is an ethical question rather than a pure legal question. But going back to the point that you made earlier, Dr. Hoffman, is that the point is that our people are proud of how they conduct themselves and how they do business, and they're not placed in these situations where they feel they're compromising their own integrity. I'll just touch on the river blindness, and you know that in 1985, Merck discovered and had done the research that an anti-parasitic, a medicine that we had called Mectizan, was effective in killing the parasites that cause river blindness in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Latin America. River blindness is caused by the bite of a black fly, which transmit these filaria, or parasites, under the skin, which causes unbearable itching. And then eventually these parasites make it into the eyes in a lot of the areas where this is endemic and cause blindness. So it's not uncommon to see youngsters leading an somebody in their 20s and 30s through the village with a stick because of river blindness. So having discovered this, Merck attempted to get funding for this so this drug could be made available in the areas that needed it, but no funding was available. So the company made the decision to give it away free as long as it was needed. But then didn't stop there. Took on the responsibility of assembling the coalitions, so the World Bank, the World Health Organization, Jimmy Carter, the Carter Center was extremely helpful in this, and as well as a number of non-governmental organizations that are involved on the ground in order to actually get this medicine to people. So the view was that, in retrospect, the decision to give it away was relatively straightforward compared to the degree of difficulty of getting it to people. And I had a chance to see that firsthand a year ago, and I flew to Tanzania to visit a small village about an hour's plane ride north of Dar es Salaam and another hour's ride in an SUV on a dirt road to Bombani, where there's very little in the way of material possessions. Literally, one of the wealthier people in the village was the person that actually had an outhouse with no sanitation facilities available. But there was the occasion of the 15th anniversary of the Mectizan donation program, and I had the honor to deliver the 250 millionth dose to a woman in this small village. But I also had the opportunity to see the people from the non-governmental organizations that help us distribute this, and literally at where roads end, and who risk their lives in conflict countries in order to get this medicine to people. So this is very inspiring, as you would expect, and an unforgettable experience. I went from there to Botswana, where in 2000 we formed a partnership with the Gates Foundation and the Republic of Botswana in order to attack HIV/AIDS in a comprehensive way, all the way from preventing transmission through treatment with antiretrovirals. So our foundation put up $50 million, the Gates Foundation put up $50 million, and we're making our medicines available free. And so we've undertaken, since that time, to attack HIV all the way from prevention of transmission through treatment with antiretrovirals. So it means training teachers about how to talk to their students in a confident way about how to prevent transmission. It means condom distribution. It means community-based organizations do hospice care, building diagnostic capability, bringing physicians from the U.S. and Europe to train doctors and nurses on AIDS patient management, building AIDS treatment and counseling centers. I did a ribbon-cutting ceremony with the president when I was there, did a groundbreaking ceremony for an orphan daycare center that our partnership helped support. And in the last 18 months, we've started ramping up significantly now that we've built infrastructure of doctors, nurses, and diagnostic capability, where we're now treating about 13,000 people, adding about 1,000 a month against a need of a little over 100,000 people that would be eligible for treatment. And the idea is, in this country, which is 1.7 million people, 38% of the adult population is infected with HIV. So this country is literally fighting for its survival. And we have an opportunity to work with the president of the country to ensure its survival, but also to create a model that can be replicated in other parts of the developing world. And I basically was asked by a successful entrepreneur, a CEO from South Africa, on the same trip, and it comes to your question. He said to me, "This is all great stuff that you're doing." And he said, "It's really, you're to be admired for it as a company, but how do you justify this to your shareholders?" And so I said, we look at it in three ways. First of all is that it's in our interest to have our medicines widely available. And so therefore creating the conditions in which people are able to use our medicines, that's in our self-interest to do that. But beyond that, it's also in our self-interest when there is a need to offer solutions on how to address that need in a way that will protect our ability to innovate. Because as I'm sure all of you have read, there's a misperception that pricing is the problem, or there's a misperception that patents are the problem. And where in fact there are no patents in these countries, and prices based on the actions we've taken at the lowest possible level. And we've been able to demonstrate that it's lack of doctors, nurses, and infrastructure that is the real barrier. So therefore, by offering solutions, we preempt potentially destructive solutions. And then finally, it's to the point that we talked about earlier. There's an immense amount of pride in the company, the fact we do this. I literally had, the there were 3 people that came to my conference room who said to me in 1999 that people are dying every day. All that's going on is a lot of finger pointing. We have to do something. And so that sort of that sense of responsibility that's built into our values and traditions, but it has a very strong measure of self-interest as well, and therefore is sustainable and is important to our shareholders. And similarly, and it is a source of long-term competitive advantage. We have relationships in various parts of the world that I think would be hard for any other company to equal at this point.
Great answer. Great answer. Question back there?
Yes. I'm Chris Elwell. I'm an adjunct in the marketing department here at Bentley. And to follow up on your comments just a moment ago, when introducing and pricing new products, how do you balance patient need with your responsibility to your shareholders to create a return on their investment?
Well, given the competitive nature of the marketplace and the influence of health plans and prescription benefit managers, we are pricing it at a competitive level compared to what's out there already and what we're competing against and who may be just behind us, because there are many fast followers in the industry at this point. So it's a market-determined price. Now, increasingly, the demand on our industry and on Merck is for novelty, drugs that really make a difference in people's lives that are better than the drugs that are already out there. We've got a distinguished record as a company of being able to do that. We operate on the leading edge of science. I think we're well known for that. And some of the advances that we've introduced, such as a drug for osteoporosis, a tablet once a day for controlling asthma, a new way of treating pain and arthritis. These are all examples of significant advances that do make a difference in people's lives and are backed up by clinical studies that show they have real health outcomes. Rather than just building bone density, we can our medicine will reduce the risk of a fracture by over 60% in women with osteoporosis. So these are real outcomes. In addition to that, we have to offer those outcomes and that novelty is at increasingly competitive prices. States are under pressure from their Medicaid programs. The private sector is more demanding of their health plans for controlling the rate of increase of drug spending. Governments all over the world are under budget pressures to support their health systems. So that not only do we have to be excellent in science, we have to be much more efficient as a company. And as a result of that, that puts us in a position of making some very tough choices. We just announced 2 weeks ago that we're reducing worldwide about 4,400 positions in the company as a way of fundamentally lowering our cost structure. It's not in response to any concern about short-term earnings or demands of Wall Street. It's basically responding to the long-term need that we have to be much more efficient as well as excellent in science. So I would say that we fulfill our responsibility to patients as well as to first. I mean, basically, that's how we take care of our shareholders. At the base of our leadership principles that I covered before, sort of the 4 pillars of character, competence, developing people and communicating. Underneath that is the George W. Merck quote that he made in a speech at the medical school at University of Virginia in 1950. And we've pulled that quote out, and it's always been part of the company, but we continue to emphasize it. And the quote is that medicines are for the people and not for the profits. If we remember that, the profits have followed, and the more we have remembered that, the more they have appeared. So therefore, it's the concept that if we serve the needs of a patient with safe, effective drugs that really make a difference in their lives and health outcomes and save their lives, basically we serve our shareholders as well. So there's no inherent conflict in that at all.
We'll take a couple of more, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely.
Mark, I see there's a couple back there, and you might want to come down to Mark because he's on a leash. The microphone is.
Hi, my name is Talaz Latimo. I'm a senior here.
Could you speak up just a little louder?
Yes, my name is Talaz Latimo. I'm a senior here. I was wondering if you could comment on the fact that some companies price their drugs differently in different countries. For example, I'm from Jordan, and if I buy some aspirin in Jordan, the price of it, it's much cheaper than if I buy it from here. And how does that follow to the ethics of pricing the same product just differently in different markets?
Well, there's a study that was recently appeared in the journal Health Affairs, which is a highly respected journal on health policy. And it was a study by Patricia Danzin, an economics professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and a study that was funded by us. And although conducted independently by her. And what she found is that drug prices, when adjusted for currencies, using purchasing power parity as a means for adjusting for differences in exchange rates, that drug prices tended to fall pretty much in line with income levels of countries. And she goes on as an economist to point out that when you have a business like ours, which is very high fixed costs for research and very low variable costs for each drug, that the way to maximize social welfare in the world is to have prices that fall in line with incomes, so therefore lower prices in lower income countries like Mexico or other parts of the world. And also, that not only maximizes social welfare, but also maximizes the economics or the profitability of the firm. So that is very rational economic behavior and all benefit. Now, where we run into difficulties with that is when countries such as in Europe or Canada is perceived to be on the same sort of income levels that Americans are. It appears unfair that Canadians would pay a lower price than Americans would pay or Europeans would pay a lower price. And it's hard to pick up a newspaper any place in the country, particularly more recently in the Boston area, without talking about importation of drugs from Canada. Now, Canada has lower prices because they impose price controls. And in addition to that, which is something that has exacerbated the difference, is the fact that the U.S. dollar has appreciated significantly against the Canadian dollar over the last several years. So therefore, our purchasing power in this country is very strong. So most goods we can buy at lower prices from Canada. The thing is that countries that impose price controls pay a penalty for that. Either they have no research-based industry, as in the case of Canada, or in Europe, their research-based industry is in a state of decline. Secondly, patients do not benefit from that because they have to wait several years in many cases in order to have access to a drug before the government will reimburse it. So Americans basically benefit from having a research-based industry that discovers more than 70% of the world's drugs. And if you're fortunate enough to have insurance, then you have access immediately. Now, when I say fortunate enough, because that is the gap that we have. Medicare is an outdated benefit, set up in 1965. It doesn't offer prescription drug coverage. Congress, in our mind, is very close to coming together and reconciling the House and the Senate bills on prescription drug coverage. And we're hopeful that they'll bridge whatever differences remain and that it'll pass it and it'll be signed by the President. So the way we should be dealing with affordability in this country is by attacking it directly through health insurance and not by importing bad policy, price controls from other countries, or, to be blunt, running the risk of importing counterfeit drugs from other countries. People with health insurance aren't going to get on a bus to go to Canada or Mexico. They're not going to go on the internet to take the risk of getting a counterfeit drug.
I'm going to take the liberty of just making a comment to sort of close down our proceedings because I know some students have another class to get off to. One of the most, I think, important things you said today, although you said many, many important things in your talk, is that a lot of people think that business ethics is just about individual ethics. individual integrity. And as Mr. Gilmartin said, obviously, individual integrity is important because we've seen over the past 18 months or more how an individual, whether it be high in the hierarchical chart
Right.
or low, can bring the reputation of a company down. But it is essential but not sufficient. What's really equally important, if not more so, is institutional integrity. And it's really great to hear someone of your stature and a company of Merck's stature talk about all of the different efforts you've made to build that institutional integrity into the organization, from training programs to an ethics office to your advice line, to building ethics into your performance evaluations. And I think it's very important for our students to hear, our young business leaders to hear, that business ethics is certainly about the ethics of individuals, but just as important about the ethics of organizations. Right. And it's really a great honor for us to have heard the head of a company who is so well thought of in terms of its ethical integrity. I wondered if you had any last thoughts to share with us before you left.
Well, I would say that it's been an outstanding experience for me to have an opportunity to address this group, and I appreciate your questions, very thought-provoking. I also think you're all fortunate to have the Center for Business Ethics on your campus because, even though it started out in 1976, in the course of business history, that's a relatively short time to have a big impact on creating, if you will, the institutional ethics that you just described. So your organization, the organization on this campus, has made a big contribution along those lines. Even as something as straightforward, perhaps, as having my chief ethics officer start and learn how to do her job better, in effect, by her experience here on this campus. And there aren't too many places, too many campuses where you're going to have that firsthand contact with an organization such as the Center for Business Ethics. And so it's a unique opportunity. And it's really pleasing to have such a big turnout for this particular lecture, plus as many people are over in the spillover room as well, because it's clear to me how important this is to you as individuals. But by virtue of the fact of having this lecture, how important it is to Raytheon and to the Center for Business Ethics, that we all have an opportunity to give you that we have an opportunity to give you an experience in which you can see more broadly just how these ideas that you're learning about here are now being integrated into corporate life on a day-by-day basis. So it's been an honor and privilege to having a chance to address this group. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Excellent. Thank you.